Hey everyone, this is the episode I think a lot of you have been waiting for. So in this episode, I'm going to talk to you about stone cutting and levitation. So this is the first of the machines that I'm going to be talking about. So this is part 4 of the series on stonework of the ancients. So let's get back to our imaginary pyramid that we were building, part 3. So we've got at this point a detailed plan, layer by layer. We've got some raw materials and we are ready to start cutting the blocks and putting them into the right place according to the plan. So we all know how stone gets cut today, and the way the ancients did it in my regressions was nothing at all like that. So describing the machine. So the stone cutting machine wasn't particularly big. Think of a tape measure, a regular, normal, modern-day tape measure, and imagine another tape measure at the other side of it. So you've got 2 tape measures with the tape in between the retractable parts of each end of the tape measure. It's kind of hard to describe it, but trying to put it into the context of something modern, that's about the closest thing I can find. The tape between the retractable components was not curved, by the way. So now I'm going to try to draw the actual machine. So we've got the 2 ends that retract and the tape, the flat tape in the middle. The things that look like spools hold the tape into place. You can just pull it to resize it, make it bigger, make it smaller until it's the right size for the block that you're wanting to cut. So the next thing we need is a rod. And you can see lots of different types of rods in the pictures in Egypt. But these rods had holes in them, like they were measuring rods. So we need 2 of these rods, 1 for each side of the device. I apologize for the quality of my diagrams, but hopefully I'm getting the message across. So each of the rods go in one end of the device. So you'll see the arrows pointing downwards where the rods would be placed. And now you can see the rods in place. And of course this would be placed exactly on the block where the cut is required. Now all we need to do is tell the device to start cutting. Do you remember in a previous episode I mentioned the strange watch kind of devices that look like flowers that I had on my wrist in my dream regressions? Well, these were used also for controlling devices. I couldn't find any graphics suitable, so using just a general graphic with a general kind of watch face, but it basically gives you the idea of how the items were controlled. So the device would be activated using the watch, which meant that it would start to vibrate. The vibration was at a frequency that would allow the rock to be sliced as if it was a piece of butter and the device was a hot knife. So at the end of all this, you've got 2 pieces of rock now instead of 1 piece of rock. So all you have to do is remove the device and move on to the next one. If you want to get fancy and complicated in what you're cutting, let's say you want to cut an L block. The rods had the ability to pin the device so that it would stop at a certain point on both sides, enabling a block to be cut down to a certain point, turned over, and then cut again to that certain point, and a part of the stone then removed, creating an L block. Pin that was inserted into the rods to essentially make sure both sides cut to exactly the same level looked a little bit like an ankh without any arms. But since I couldn't find any graphics of Ankhs without arms, I just used an Ankh graphic, so you'll just have to imagine that it didn't have the arm sticking out of it. So when it gets slotted into the rod, it just sits there and it stops the device from going any further. As an aside, has anyone noticed the hats of the ancient Egyptians? Some of them have a weird-looking proboscis thing sticking out of them. So I've put a couple of pictures that I could find up. And the proboscis, it looks as if it's part of the mechanism of the device. It's almost like the ancient Egyptians found a broken one of these devices and used a part of it because it was maybe recognized as being from the ancients and used it as one of their hats, which is cute but weird, I think. I'd love to see one of those hats in person so I can verify that it really does look like the internal bits of one of these mechanisms. That would be so cool. And I guess it's another reason I really want to go to visit Egypt, because I can't help thinking that a walk around the museum there, I could see a lot of things that I recognise from my dream regressions. So you may ask, so did it only cut relatively small blocks? No, we could cut some pretty big things like Al-Nasr. I'm not saying that right. Al-Nasr in Saudi Arabia looks exactly like one of the giant boulders that we were able to cut. Obviously, the device was stretched a little bit wider and we had to go a lot higher, but it worked in exactly the same way. So now let's move on to levitation. Now, you might wonder why I have combined the episodes of simple stone slicing with levitation. And that's because the devices had certain similarities to them. The first similarity being that before being opened up and used, they looked simply like very small scrolls. You see pictures of these devices in many museums that have got Egyptian artifacts. I just went to the Met Museum because the pictures that you can get there are public domain, and I couldn't find any pictures of this sort of thing on the app that I'm using. I'm using Canva for most of my graphics, so it mostly does what I need. But every now and again, I've got to go to a museum and find some public domain photos in order to fully show you what it is that I'm trying to portray. So those weird cylinder-looking things that the statues are holding are what are called rods of Horus. They're also called the wands of Horus, which makes them sound a lot more magical. And also they are called healing wands. I can't tell you what we called them because I can't actually remember. I'm so sorry about that. By the look of the statues, I would say that the ancient Egyptians considered them symbols of power. By that I mean regal power, so that a pharaoh would have one of these because a pharaoh is important. In some of the statues, you see them holding one in one hand, as in the picture that you can see now, or you see them holding two. In the picture that I found, which is now showing, one of the people in the statue is holding another device that looks exactly like what I was talking about earlier with regards to the clips that would go inside the rods to hold the mechanism to a certain point before cutting. Some of these rods on the statues look flat-topped and others looked kind of sausage-shaped. But I assure you they are all the same device. If you've listened to my other episodes, then you may remember an episode on flying and the technology around that. So the rods that go around the waist for flight are basically the same technology. So let's get back to block levitation, shall we? So we'll start with these wands. So they actually open up in much the same way that the rods that we saw for the cutting actually work as well. So these items look like they're just one rod, but when they are opened up, they are essentially two rods with paper-thin, very flexible alloy, I think it is. It's kind of metal, but it's bendable and soft between them, scrolled very tightly. You can pull them open and you will have this very thin paper-like wafer, let's call it a wafer, that you can place underneath the stones for levitation. Ideally, you'd have two of these for a block. You could possibly do it with one, if the other end was a wheelbarrow, I guess, but no, let's just assume two of them. So we've got two of these items and we've got a block and we're going to lift it. So the first thing is to get it underneath the block. So it has to be lifted and slid under. So a crowbar kind of device is what's needed for that purpose. And the crowbars that we had also had a bit of technology in them. So as soon as you got the end near, you could just basically lift the corner up and slide the wafer with the rods under it. The crowbar device that I put in the picture is pretty close to one of the types of crowbars we had. There was another type which was just a long bar with a very gentle curve, but the end of the bar was very, very, very thin and yet incredibly strong. So these fabulous crowbar things were used for the initial lift in order to get the wafers underneath the blocks, and then for later on, when you've got the blocks into the right position, for placing them down gently and retracting the pieces of wafer. The technology has a few complications. The parts of the case which the wafer scrolls up into and lives in, they can sit on the end of each end of the wafer. They give the communication in terms of activating and deactivating the actual wafer. But once activated, they are not necessary to continue with the use of the wafer. So you can actually remove one or both ends. But the problem with that is that it'll just keep doing what you actually asked it to do before you removed the ends, because you have no way of telling it now to go up higher, go down lower. All you have is it levitating to a certain position. And that can be fine in certain circumstances, but that's not always what you want. So without at least one of those end pieces, we're unable to use the watch kind of device, the thing that I mentioned before with the petals on it, no longer able to use that to control the wafers for the levitation, whether, to get it go up and get it to come down. So as you can guess, when it comes to placing the block onto our imaginary pyramid, at least one end of the device has to be removed. And the frontmost piece would then be controlling the gentle lowering of the block as it's pushed into place, and one of the special technology crowbars will then finally fit the block into a very tight position on the pyramid. I almost forgot to mention how we achieved the forward momentum. It's really very, very easy. You just push it. So all it took was somebody walking behind the block. Like, I'm just taking my pet rock for a nice walk. Okay, I think that's pretty much the nuts and bolts of the levitation. I can't think of anything else to tell you which isn't getting really, really complicated. But I can share with you a really interesting regression that I had when it was towards the end of my life, when I was spending time in Egypt. And I noticed that one of the Egyptians had some of that wafer. They didn't have either of the rods that the wafer attaches to, and they certainly didn't have the watch device that was used to control it. But they'd managed to work out how to make the wafer jump. So it was really amazing. They got two of these wafers underneath a block, and they managed to find that, I don't know how, must have been trial and error. They'd managed to find the right frequency. So they whacked the block really hard with what looked like a tuning fork. It made a ringing sound anyway, and the block just lifted. They pushed the block, and after about a few meters, it just came back down onto the ground. And so they just whacked it again, and it lifted, and they just pushed it forward a little bit, and then it came down onto the ground. And then they whacked it again, and it was very entertaining. They were smart enough to work out that they couldn't whack it while it was still in the air, or it would just go higher and then be out of their control. I guess that's the problem with residual technology, but it's still good to see initiative being used so that they could at least use a little bit of it. So that's the end of that episode, and I will be moving on to the larger, more complicated machines that were used for scooping. There's a lot more to them, so that's probably going to be a whole episode in its own right. So thanks everybody, and I will catch you all next time.